Hey everyone, let's take a moment now to talk about the AT case study, particularly parts 2 and 3. So your AT case study for SPED 7411 has 4 parts. You've done part 1, which is the background of your case study student. And at that point, at the end of that, I asked you to give me a general idea of what you thought your goal might be for this project. Um, and that's to help you sort of target the next section, which is part 2. Part 2 is where you actually complete a needs assessment using a specific process guide from the Georgia Department of Ed. And then you're going to use that information from that assessment to choose a device or a tool, AT device or tool, and then lay out your implementation plan for this project. Because essentially what you're going to do is you're going to conduct a little active research. That's where we get into part 3. Part 2, you're developing your research plan, your implementation plan of how you're going to train the student in the use of the device or tool. Part 3 is where you conduct that plan, you take data along the way, and then you evaluate the effectiveness of the plan overall. And then the last piece is a video demonstration. This can be done with the student if you have permission for that, but it doesn't have to be with the student. It could just be you demonstrating the tool or the device. And then you're also going to reflect on how the project went overall within that video. But today we're just going to focus on primarily part 2, which is the needs assessment. So part of this process is you're going to choose the device or tool based on the area of need. You kind of did that in part 1. Now we're going to take this time to help you make sure you look at the big picture and hone into what is really the most important or most feasible thing to work on. So what you need to do is complete the GPAT AT consideration process guide. I have included a sample of a completed one. I have given you the template for that, as well as the resource guide that goes along with that. And that it does like a step-by-step, what am I supposed to do in each section? That's what that resource guide tells you. So you will take that basically the next step for you now is to complete that consideration guide. And we're going to go into that more in the next slide or so. Kind of in all the main areas of need of your student, and that will help you like I said, get that big picture. Because the AT you are thinking about may be used in multiple environments and multiple content areas, multiple need areas, or in your exploration here, you might discover that the student has a different higher level of need area that you might want to focus on instead. So you'll complete that, and then the results from that will help you determine what specific AT device or tool you're going to implement for this project. And then with that, you're going to determine a measurable goal that's aligned with that AT. So you're going to create essentially what the design of it should be like an IEP goal in that it's very specific and observable and measurable, okay? But it's for more like a 6-week time period because it's for the end of when you would have time to take data on this AT implementation process. So once you have the results that determine your AT device and then the measurable goal, then you will design your implementation plan along with the data collection tool you're going to use. All of that is going to be in your part 2 submission to me. So step 1, chosen device or area of need. You already established the general focus area in part 1 of this case study. Now you need to complete the GPAT AT consideration guide just to make sure you have considered all the areas of need, but also what those different environments may look like, because that may affect how and when you implement the training and who all you need to involve in that training process. Step 2 is the GPAT AT consideration guide. And here is a sample of a kind of partially completed one anyways. So you know what I'm talking about here. So see, we have lots of different areas that could be considered. Now, I want you to think about your student, and we're going to focus in on what are all the areas of need for your student. So I know you might have chosen like you want to focus on writing for this project. That's fine. But is that the only area of need your student has? Chances are probably not. So please select all of them that are relevant for your student. Now, that may mean you're selecting just about every single one of them, or it may mean you're selecting more like two or three, but I would say there should definitely be more than one here that's considered an area of need for our students. All right. So read through all of these. This is where you check off the area of need in section 1. Section 2 talks about the 2 through 6 talk about the different columns and what they mean. And the columns are, we see the top of them below, labeled A through E, right? A is area and instructional task. So for example, this one is talking about writing, written composition. So that area or instructional task aligns with the number 1 up here that are checked. So this Then under writing written composition, you fill out each section. What are the standard classroom materials the student uses in this area? What are the accommodations or modifications or strategies that like are on the IEP already that you might already be using? And outside of that, what are assistive technology solutions? Whether they're already being used or you are thinking about using, or you do some research and find some things, put those there. And then E is other possible solutions. Um, oh, I'm sorry. D is assistive technology that's currently being used. So you gathered this information in background in part 1. So you're just going to now you're going to plop that into these tables, into this consideration guide. You might need to expand on it a little bit. You might need to observe the different environments that the student might use this in to get more of an idea. For example, in the standard classroom materials that are being used in those locations, that might be something you don't necessarily have all the information for. But E is where then you would put possible solutions. So here's where you do some research, you start brainstorming. What are some ideas that might also help the student in this area? And those can be accommodations, strategies, other AT, services that go with AT, that kind of thing. Here's an additional, sample. It goes into, it's still in written composition and organizing thoughts. So they categorized it into 2 areas. This one was focusing on organizing thoughts and then breaking it down as to what's available in the classroom right now with regard to that. Maybe there's also a graphic organizer under standard classroom materials. That would depend on the classroom, I suppose. Accommodations and modifications that are being used. What AT is being used already? What are some other ideas? You get the idea, right? So you do that for each area of need. Reading, the communication piece, so on and so forth. The very end of it, basically after you've looked at all of those things, you determine, and you would do this normally as a team. Right now you're going to do it on your own, but you determine whether no AT is not required or yes, AT is required. For this case study, if you're checking no, then this was probably not the right student to select for the case study. We're supposed to be using an AT, so hopefully you're choosing yes. And that the IEP needs team, and then you check AT is required and the IEP team knows the nature of what's needed, or the IEP team needs additional information. Because of the nature of this project, we're supposed to be looking at getting more information. So that's the one you'd want to check. After you fill out the consideration guide and you look it over, the next thing you need to do is develop a specific and measurable goal for this AT tool, whatever it is you decide you're going to use. What do you want the student to be able to show you or demonstrate using the AT by the end of your data collection time, which is about 6 weeks? So you're not going to, probably change the world in 6 weeks. In fact, you might have less than 6 weeks Just keep in mind that's approximately the time frame you would have if you start this right when you submit part 2 and you end it right when you're ready to submit part 3, about 6 weeks. So write that goal like you would an IEP goal, in that it is specific and measurable. So I have a little format example. This is not um, absolutely how you should write it. It's going to give you kind of a framework. How you write this goal will deeply depend on what it is the student is trying, what you want them to be able to do and what they're using. So I encourage you to bring your example goals to maybe a time for questions, or ask me about it if you think, if I think it's appropriate, before you get too deep. That I'm certainly willing to give you some advice on that. Student A, so by the end of the case study, because that's our time frame, right? Student A will what? What will student A do using that tool? And you really want to incorporate the use of the AT tool within this goal. And then achieving a criteria of what level of criteria are we looking for here? What's a reasonable level of accuracy by the end of 6 weeks? And I don't want you to do one that says, with 3 prompts from the teacher. I want you to think, what can we harness or what can we target as an independent goal for the student by the end of that 6 weeks? So even if you have to pull back a little bit on your ultimate goal, think about, what do you think the student could do independently with the appropriate amount of training and support in using the AT. After you have your measurable goal, you want to create your data collection tool. This will make it a whole lot easier for you as you are implementing your training and data collection part of this project, if you design your data collection tool before you begin, because then you'll have something, what you're looking for, you have something that's easy to mark. I showed a little example of a task analysis data collection tool. Now, this is about washing hands, which obviously has nothing to do with AT in this sense. So do not do a washing hands task analysis. But for many of you, teaching a student to use the AT device might very well be a task analysis. That might be the best way to go about training them on it. It's not always the case, but I just thought this would be a good example. So this one shows the steps to the washing of the hands, so broken down into 11 steps. There's a score column where, either they did the step or they didn't. There's also a prompt level, which is important to know, right? Did they need a full prompt, a full physical, partial physical, gestural, or were they independently doing that step? Okay, you can set those prompts up to whatever prompting system you would use and notation you would use. I just want to give you kind of an idea of what you could do. Okay, so you want to design that data collection tool based on the goal you wrote. So what would be what would connect to that goal? What would show you the information that you need to answer whether that student achieved the goal or not? Once you have those two pieces, then it should be pretty easy to develop the next part, which is, what is your procedure or implementation plan? Now, anytime you are taking data on something like this, you really want to have a specific procedure, and so that everybody sort of follows the same steps to make sure that we can show the connection between the procedures we implemented and the data we collected. And then if we're all kind of consistent about that, then it's easier to figure out if there's a piece in that procedure that's not specifically working. If everybody's doing it a little differently, it's really hard to tell what worked, what may not have worked for the student. So what are your steps? You're going to outline your steps to AT implementation. These are the things you're going to think about. When, where, and how will the training of the student and any staff that would be helping with this take place? More specifically, who's going to train the student? Is it going to be you? If it's not you, then you have to make sure you have the other person super trained on what the procedures are. And then once you figure that out, how will you train the student? And here you want to go back to the literature. What evidence-based strategies are you going to use to train the student? And this is a great time, especially if you're in my other class and you're doing a lot of research on evidence-based strategies for students with autism. If that is the student you're working with, then go back to that stuff. If you've taken other classes where you've done some research on evidence-based practices for the students that you work with, here's the time to go back to that information and pull it out. Go back to those texts that you've had in earlier classes that talk about, direct instruction, differentiated instruction, chaining, um, systematic instruction using prompting systems, model lead test procedures. What procedures are you going to, what strategies are you going to use? Some sort of positive behavior support so we can motivate the student to engage. You might be using several strategies. You might just really be focusing on one, but use a strategy like that to help you design your plan of how you're going to train the student in this process. Okay, and if you are struggling with that, reach out. Come with your questions in our time for question sessions, or set up a time to talk with me because I'll help you problem solve that. But go to the literature. That's what we want you to do. All right. So within everything you write up for part two, which the template sort of gives you directions there, we'll include these pieces. Now, that doesn't mean that you won't, that your tools may not change. I'm sorry, your tools might change. Your data collection tool might have to be adjusted as you get into it. Your implementation plan might have to be tweaked a little bit. So just like there might be some changes between part one and part two as far as your goal of what you're working on for your student, there might be some changes between part two and part three of how you eventually implemented your plan. That's okay, but this at least sets you up on the right foot, on the right track to get you started. All right. Hopefully that helps you get going. Again, please let me know as you dig into this what your questions are, and I'd be happy to talk them through with you. Take care, everybody.